Thank you, Helga. Thank you, Richard and Margaret Beck. And thank you also, John Tucker and Bill Wilkerson, previous coordinators of the Beck Fund. Louder? Yeah. Okay, I'll try. Okay, now giants and trolls. You can see that the first one is just a real picture of real Icelandic landscape. The other one is an artistic rendering. And what I will do is very briefly introduce giants and trolls, and then very briefly look at W.D. Wilkerson and David Arneson and trolldom in Canada, and then spend more time on Johan Magnus Bjarnason's Young Icelanders' Encounters with Trolls in Nova Scotia. He may be perhaps the writer that you know the least, this book here. And both of these books, I think there are 3 or 4 copies still in the student bookstore, if you're interested in buying the books. Okay, giants. I've been learning quite a bit about giants that I didn't know before. And in fact, it seems that the world, according to Northern European myth, it started with a giant. The hermaphrodite Jötun, both male and female in one body, he was spontaneously created when ice and fire sort of clashed in really the area of nothingness, Ginnunga Gap. Okay, so this is how it all began, this humongous giant. And the same clash of ice and fire created Auðhumla, which was lucky for Ymir because that's where he got his sustenance, from the cow Auðhumla. And they multiplied, as cows and guys will do. And then again, as happens in families, their 3 great-grandsons tore old Ymir apart. But they made the world from Ymir. And it just occurred to me because it turns out that Midgard, the home of human beings, was made from Ymir's eyebrows. And it just occurred to me because there's always this sort of oval shape to ancient Northern European buildings in Iceland, and in fact here in Lanzo Meadows. And it seems that this, it looks to me like a couple of eyebrows meeting. So perhaps the shape of Midgard has been reproduced for a while in the buildings. But again, the world ends with giants. During Ragnarök, the end of the world, according to Völuspá, the poem where the prophetess speaks. And it's the giants who come out in hordes and destroy the world as people know it. And the children of Loki are absolutely essential in bringing about the end of the world, swallowing up what can be swallowed, and it seems that the gods could be swallowed. But the thing is that interestingly, Odin was one of the 3 guys who went and killed his great-grandfather. And he's the only one who remains seen of these gods. And I find it very interesting that that the gods are all in some way descended from the giants, but they're also destroyed by the giants. According to Snorri Sturluson in Heimskringla, giants were simply evil, even if the gods were also descended from giants. And he also records in Heimskringla that Surtur, really the blackened one, the one who is the god or the giant of volcanic activity, he is one of the guardian spirits of Iceland, and that was the giant in the first image in my opening slide. Now, the word tröll or troll in Iceland today, and in fact from some centuries, really was used and is used as a synonym for giant. And the same thing also happened in Norway, that trolls that was the word that somehow shifted onto giants. So Jötun, the ones from mythology, Þurs, Risi, Flagð, Gígur, and Skessa, all of these words today have the same meaning in Icelandic. The last two, Gígur and Skessa, they are reserved for females only. Flagð can be both male and female, and is not a flattering term. Now, but the original meaning of troll is pretty much the same as it's in common use today. It means to craze, to madden, to make wild, to make something uncontrolled, animalistic, hazardous, usually by magical powers, but not necessarily. Just, it's something that is very negative. It may be inherent, or it may be learned. And in fact, in the old writings, it seemed that any being could become a troll, or could be referred to as a troll, if they were seen as being hostile and dangerous, and disregarding all humanity. They might be referred to as trolls. So humans, the undead, elves, dwarves, giants, all of these might be referred to as trolls. And this comes out very clearly in a book by Ármann Jakobsson that came out a year ago, The Troll Within You. And it's an interesting book. It's not, it's fairly easy to read, and in fact, I'm sure that it takes you less time to read the book than the footnotes. Okay, and Ármann Jakobsson traces the original meaning through medieval times in the Icelandic sagas. He specifically focuses on the Icelandic sagas. And he suggests that trolls functioned as metaphors really for the destructive forces of chaos that must be fettered and controlled by the gods of Asgard, but also within every human being. That it's simply the sort of the darker side of humanity that should not be allowed to totally take over. Okay, but giant trolls. These are the kind of trolls that existed when emigration started from Iceland to Canada. And these are the kinds of trolls that I grew up thinking were the only trolls in the world. In Norwegian, to refer to Norwegian again, trolls are, for example, in Henrik Ibsen's Per Gynt, the trolls are giants, but also crazed. And troll apparently has a much wider application in Norwegian. It can refer to any kind of sort of otherworldly being. But giant trolls, according to Ólafur Sveinsson, giant trolls started appearing in kenning metaphors in the 11th century. And then they became more and more noticeable until the 14th century, when troll had really become consistently synonymous with jötun, or giant, ogre, giantess, ogress, troll wife. These are the terms that have been used for the female giants, giantess, ogress, and troll wife. Now, most of the giant troll stories, according to Sveinsson in his book on folk stories, most of the giant troll stories were composed in medieval times. And it was then that there were numerous bishop sagas that were written in manuscript and then copied, as was the custom. And so many of the bishops would go out and exorcise trolls. And of course, I mean, the more trolls that were exorcised, the fewer there were around. And it seems that the bishops went in particular after the male troll, whereas Thor was particularly sort of observant of female trolls and wanted to keep them out. But the bishop sagas, and in fact Christianity, according to Einar Ólafur Sveinsson, may have simply done away with belief in trolls. And so according to the lore, the male trolls eventually just became extinct. And there are many stories of ogresses chasing down and abducting men. And some of them they want for a bedfellow, and sometimes there are two ogresses sharing one. But in other instances, they simply want something good to eat. And what could really spoil their dinner was if someone had just come from church, because then they were sort of all black around the mouth, and they were not keen to eat people who had been, just come from communion. Now, the thing is that it seems that despite all the abductions in troll stories, they didn't manage to stay alive, so they only existed in the stories. And Einar Ólafur Sveinsson points out that, of course, stories can be made even if the faith has long gone. And he asserts that trolls had gone by 1600. The faith in trolls had simply exhausted itself, even if the stories remained. Now, then we have ogress immigrants and troll immigrants. And according to W.D. Valgerson in his short story The New World, in his collection What the Bear Said, trolls experienced the usual adjustment problems that was customary in migrant relocation. So they had to adjust after they came to Canada. But so they did, at least some of them. And as you probably know, if you have lived close to Arborg, there is a troll that lives under a bridge there, at least according to Valgerson. And there's another one who found himself a cave. And caves are not necessarily all that easy to find in Canada. But he now shares one in the Narcissus snake dens. And according to the story, he never goes hungry because he can endlessly pick a meal from his companions. And perhaps good for those in the neighborhood that he changed his diet. According to David Arneson in The Demon Lover, Winnipeg is teeming with trolls and ogresses. And but according to his stories, the ogresses are still more enterprising than the trolls. So in a story called The Ogress, we learn that ogresses come into their own at the age of 12. And they do not need to live in a cave or under a bridge. They can be hidden somewhere in a home, and you really don't know it until you see it, that she is an ogress. A man-eating ogress. Okay, so in fact, according to the ogress, they really didn't change their diet after coming to Canada. Nor did they quit shape-shifting. They will still sort of, grow giantly tall. In the mare, we discover that there are Winnipeg ogresses who have become upwardly mobile because the mayor decided to win the upcoming elections by getting rid of all the ogresses and their habitats, some of them not all that cool, and these were all under the city's bridges. So next time you go to Winnipeg, you might want to look one up. Now, old folktale motifs serve to reflect upon modern realities and concerns. For instance, how to achieve your aims. And through unlikely stories like troll stories and of ogresses, that can still be done. According to Valgertsen in What the Bear Said, in order to pursue worthwhile dreams, you must be ready to suffer severe hardship. And in a story called Sigur's Prayer, he also points out that among the difficulties may be to confront a carnivorous troll. In Quarantine, the character has to outwit emissaries of the devil, or rather one particular emissary of the devil, and his cunning offers. And she simply has to outwit him. Or, in The Troll Wife, wait patiently and help along the magic moments. Okay, I'm not giving away too much because I think I don't want to totally wreck your reading of these stories. And same in David Arneson, in the Wizard of Selkirk Avenue, he gives the hint, or the story gives the hint, that you may also want to be practical and take a close look at attainable goals before deciding what dream to pursue. Okay, so nothing can stop you when you have a couple of trolls or magicians in somewhere between your ears. Okay, but this guy, just out of curiosity, may I please see how many of you have read this here novel? Wow, many more than I expected. But the rest of you, you've got something good coming up then. Okay, so This is a historical novel about Eiríkur Hansson, and it's based on the Icelandic settlement in Mooseland Hills in Nova Scotia, which existed. I'm giving sort of the widest possible time frame from 1874, when only a few young Icelandic men went to Mooseland Hills, and then 1882. Jóhann Magnús Bjarnason was in fact among the last people to leave the settlement in 82. Then the Winnipeg boom had just about sort of exhausted itself. But what interests me in that novel is that he's not really giving away sort of on the surface that he's dealing with giantesses or trolls. He depicts two Canadian foster mothers, and if you have read any immigrant literature, you will know that very often a foster mother or a foster father is a representative for, especially foster mother, for the country that the immigrant is being fostered by. Okay, and there are these two Canadian foster mothers, and they suggest to me at least two aspects of the national spirit. One pointing to the colonial past, to empire, but the other to a multicultural future. And what Bjarnason does is to develop these two characters through imagery and actions that suggest trolls, to me at least. Anyway, Eiríkur means eternally rich, but a lot of people today think that it means quite the opposite, that it means poor, meaning that not rich. But the old meaning of means endlessly, eternally. So he's eternally rich, and he is the son of Hans, which can mean son of man, every man, but it can also simply mean son of Hans. Now, in many ways, the novel stays close enough to Jóhann Magnús Bjarnason's life, in the beginning at least, so that a lot of people assume that this was only a historical novel. But if you read the novel, you discover that it's sort of like a fantasy narrative. I mean, there are just, strange things going on all the time, and sort of fantastic events. But Eiríkur is raised by his grandparents in Iceland. His mother dies, and his father goes to America and is never heard of again. Eiríkur Hansson learns to read and memorize stories and poetry from an old crone, and to me that's sort of like the Edda, because in fact the main source of the stories of mythology and folklore is the Edda, and or the Eddas, and Edda is assumed to mean in fact grandmother. So an old crone, and this old crone tells him tales of elves and trolls and ghosts and changelings, fetches, wizards, witches, and monsters of land and sea, all the good things in life. And her favorite is Grýla, the troll who feeds on ill-behaved and ill-kempt children. Okay. Then Eiríkur Hansson emigrates with his grandparents to Mooseland Hills in Nova Scotia when he is 6. He goes to school there until grandfather dies when Eiríkur is 11, and the teacher is a Scotsman, and this was apparently the case when the settlement was there. And he never spared the rod, it says in the novel, but everything that he taught really stuck. So it was good teaching in that respect. The grandmother is left destitute, and she agrees to let Eiríkur be adopted by a rich Nova Scotian widow, Mrs. Patrick. And her main dream really is that he can have an opportunity to get an education. And of course, better opportunities in every way to get on in the world. And so the lady comes, Mrs. Patrick comes with her driver to pick him up, and then Eiríkur never sees his grandmother after that. After his second successful escape from Trollish, Mrs. Patrick, he is a fugitive who is on the run all the time. He is taken in and employed by a succession of individuals, Icelandic and Canadian, but eventually he finds a safe foster home in Halifax until he moves to Manitoba to farm, and by then he is a married man, and he is just 1 year short of graduating from Dalhousie University. Okay, so this is the basic plot summary. And Mrs. Patrick, she fosters by oppression. But first, she lures with sweets and promises, just like the witch in Hansel and Gretel, or Hans og Greta in Icelandic. Remember Eiríkur, Hans, son of Hans, and this is the title in Icelandic, Hans og Greta. Mrs. Patrick smothers Eiríkur with kisses and elaborate endearments, and really they are wonderful. They are so colorful. My beautiful peacock and whatever. I mean, and very, very many of the terms are quite edible. But anyway, she overwhelms him and tells him that he can call her mother, in fact must only call her mother, that he is to be blood of her blood, and she stresses that he will inherit her wealth. So yes, a lot of goodies are coming up. She makes him, during the first night, she makes him kneel at her feet, and she really shovels spiced bread and applesauce into his mouth, and does it so rapidly that, as it says in the novel, he always has 3 bites to chew on, no matter how he swallows. She forces him to eat more after he's full, and then she wakes him up in the middle of the night to serve him Dutch schnapps so that he can sleep. And like the ogresses who held men captive in their caves, Mrs. Patrick is so jealous of Eiríkur's attention and affection that she doesn't allow him to attend school. Instead, she gets him a tutor. And the thing is that in many ways she is like the troll wives or the ogresses who could smell a human a long way off, and didn't want their caves to be cluttered with humans unless they had one that they were sort of cultivating for whatever reason. But anyway, so she really keeps him separate rather than allow him to integrate and go to school. She keeps him apart, and she will not let him out of the house. And she makes very clear that he is to forget his family, his background, his name, and he's to become an English boy, as she says. And he is to become Patrick or Pat for short. And whenever he resists her, she really becomes abusive, and her sort of abusive terms are almost as good as her endearments. They are so fanciful. But she is abusive until she gets her way. And it says in the novel, her will reign supreme. When Eiríkur tries to run away, she has him picked up and returned. And to punish him for having run away, she whips him with a lash, almost to death. And it takes him days to recover after the treatment. And then by then, when he comes to, there are bars on his window so that he cannot escape again. But with some help, he eventually does. Okay, so these are two of the sides of Mrs. Patrick. There are more because Saint Patrick, of course, is the Irish saint and martyr who was in fact a slave at one time. He was English, but was picked up by the Romans and turned into a slave. But he later became Christian and is now the main saint of Ireland. And Mrs. Patrick hails from Ireland in the story. But anyway, she is very much like the carnivorous witch in Hansel and Gretel. By the way, she overindulges Eiríkur as if she's fattening him for the kill. But she also, of course, in that way resembles carnivorous Grýla, the dreaded figure of his childhood. And primarily they resemble these figures in the way that they want to sort of, gobble up and swallow all of his identity and history and family. In fact, everything that makes Eiríkur Hansson himself. But then there's another figure who is not quite as ghoulish, in fact, quite far from it. She is Mrs. Patrick's opposite. She is the embodiment of discretion and restraint. Her house is filled with flowers and sort of, cultivated objects of culture and beauty. And her whole environment is furnished for sort of aesthetic effect and comfort, not only for affluence, as is the case with Mrs. Patrick. Because she's a show-off, she pays all of her staff well, but nobody wants to work for her, nonetheless, unless they absolutely have to. Okay, so Mrs. Hamilton is a wealthy widow of noble English background who lives in Halifax, and she adopts young Aðalheiður Einarsdóttir after Aðalheiður's father dies, and she nurses Aðalheiður to health after she's been at death's door. And that's really where Eiríkur Hansson comes in, because he first meets Mrs. Hamilton at night, because a cousin of Mrs. Hamilton comes to Dalhousie University to Eiríkur's room and asks him whether he could please come along and help out with a young Icelandic lady. They need a letter read and translated from Icelandic, and then they also need someone to write a reply to the young woman's mother in Iceland. And the young woman is extremely ill, and everything is dark. I mean, it's in the middle of the night, everything is dark, and Eiríkur becomes extremely worried whether the guy who picks him up is perhaps one of the guys that Mrs. Patrick has looking for him. And he also worries that this young woman may have landed in the same situation as he himself. But Mrs. Hamilton is quite different. She lets her foster daughter keep her old name until they come up with a compromise. And Ethel is really the same name as Adal or Adele, and Mrs. Hamilton goes to great lengths to let Ethel or Aðalheiður keep contact with her mother in Iceland. So even if Mrs. Hamilton keeps a sort of a watchful eye on her, she lets the girl attend school, and she eventually sends her to a ladies' academy. So, quite different. But what is strange in all of Bjarnason's descriptions of Mrs. Hamilton is that he keeps comparing her to marble. And also, she's sort of surrounded in darkness when he first sees her. And there are so many associations with night and people turned into stone, except that she is someone who looks like a marble statue turned into a human being, a marble statue that has come alive. So in a way, she seems like a shapeshifter who has a night troll who has seen the light, turned into stone, and in fact her Diana, the marble statue that she resembles, Diana seems to have the core meaning in Latin of light or day. And so she is quite the opposite to Mrs. Patrick in every way. This statue here used to stand in the Halifax Gardens, but apparently it has been removed. This here image is by Ásmundur Jónsson, and it shows a favorite story among Icelanders of a night troll. This is a night troll that's trying to lure a young woman to come out and join him in his cave, but she outsmarts him. She gets him gets him into a dialogue that keeps him by his window for so long that eventually there's daylight and he turns to stone. So when everyone in the household returns and she was left alone during the night, there's this gigantic rock outside of the window. Anyway, so Mrs. Hamilton is described like a statue that's come to life, a stone statue or a marble statue come to life. Mrs. Patrick and Mrs. Hamilton really are diametric opposites as foster mothers, and to me they allegorically suggest citizenship that's offered on two very, very different terms. Mrs. Patrick demands erasure of personal and ethnic history and identity, but Mrs. Hamilton offers assimilation by mutual negotiation and respect. the young woman can simply sort of find her way sort of with Mrs. Hamilton's guidance, but not overwhelmed by it. So Mrs. Patrick is stuck in the colonizing strategies of empire, but Mrs. Hamilton points forward to multicultural strategies of inclusion. And to me, Jóhann Magnús Bjarnason is really an early example of the imaginative ways that Canadian authors of Icelandic descent have found to use the ancient Northern European lore that was shaped for a while in Iceland in order to depict new realities and new experience. So, ta-da! So this is Surtur. This is one of the key figures, the Jotuns who come along during Ragnarök and help to destroy the world. But then, of course, a new world arises, Gimli. Any questions?
And I would also just like to remind you that we are recording this, so if you do not want to ask a question, you can write it down and hand it to me and I'll ask it for you.
Want to get a picture of this crowd?
I know it's a...
Guðrún, thank you for that talk. It was fun and interesting.
Thank you.
I'm interested in the origin story. So, if the world began with a giant, not a cow, but a giant, and if giants, according to Snorri Sturluson, if giants are all evil, then we're saying the world began through evil. And that's a horrible way to think of it, where there's no balance, and then it ends with bloodshed, with the grandsons, and Ragnarok is going to be horrible. It's all very dark. Can you talk a bit about that?
Very dark because, in fact, this is very parallel to Kronos. Time, Kronos, eating his own children, but still not getting away with it. So, in fact, it seems like the giants are figures of time and both creation and destruction. So very odd and to throw in the cow, I think is pretty interesting.
Existential angst is very Icelandic, I think.
Sorry?
Existential angst is very Icelandic then.
No, I don't think so. I think the last existential angst person may have been stuck and mounted on a shelf or something. I don't know. No, perhaps I'm exaggerating. Perhaps there's a lot of it. No, in fact, I think it's just the cycle of life, the cycle of time. For the individual, the world starts magically, and who raises you? It's a giant. You may call the giant mommy or daddy, but they're still giants, aren't they? So, and then you get
I also have a question when you're done.
Yeah.
Has there been any portrayals in cinema of the troll?
Oh, the trolls. Let's see. Sorry? Oh, right. Yes. Yeah, Gillikru. Yeah. Yes, that's not very many films. Síðasti bærinn í dalnum. Yeah. It from the what? 60s, 50s?
No, the 50s.
Yeah.
Well, earlier, late 40s. I mean, the man who portrayed the giant, I met him in 73 or 4. So before 74.
Mhm.
He was pretty old then, but he had played, he was a policeman who
So,
played
so
the,
it could
the
have been
giant.
in the 30s, 40s.
It was in the 40s,
Yeah,
possibly.
yeah.
In the late 40s, after the Second World War.
Yeah, but the thing is that you know, fantasy literature and fantasy films are teeming with giants of all sorts. And, you know, they may be kind, but they may also be threatening. And if you go to, if you look up giants, Icelandic giants today, you'll see children's books with, you know, loads and loads of very kind giants. And there's a cave in Keflavik where the airport is. There's a cave there that has this big figure, a giantess who is sleeping and snoring, making all kinds of sort of mumbling sounds and rude body sounds but she is behind, not bars, but still like a cage. And little kids apparently are encouraged to go there, and if they, you know, if the parents want to get rid of the soother, you know, that's where you take it. You get her to look up. And kids are really afraid of this figure, even if she is asleep in a rocking chair. But you know, you can see that she's breathing and making all kinds of sounds. So yes, trolls are a part of our tradition, and Einar Ólafur Sveinsson, in the bibliography that is the next slide. I should just show you that. Let's see. No, I've totally forgotten what I was going to say. So it probably wasn't all that good to begin with.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Just the beginning giant, he was both female and male.
Yes.
So are you sure that, like, it mentioned the cow as his source of nourishment, but also his mate? Wouldn't it have been that the children were created out of...
She is said to be the grandmother of Odin, believe it or not.
I can't believe it.
Well,
I just, but I was wondering, like the cow was to be the grandmother, or the. So why do you
we
think
have
it was
a god who has a grandmother who is a cow.
But what was the purpose then of having two sexes for the original giant?
I don't
If
know.
only the
There-
male part made it, was there a bowl around for the woman part?
Nope. Nope. There was a giant. Yeah, there was Ymir. Yeah. So in fact, I mean, so many folklorists say a lot in this mythology does not make very much sense. No, I mean, if you just look at the children of Loki, I mean, he changes himself into a female being time and again. And you know, who's to say that Auðhumla is not a woman who can transform herself into a cow? We just don't know. The thing is that now I remember what I was going to say about Einar Ólafur Sveinsson. He points out that, you know, the mythology is from way back. This is the Northern European mythology. It's the belief, the actual belief of people who arrive in Iceland, sort of, you know, towards 800, 900 something. In the year 1000, the religion is changed. And in fact, everything relating to the old faith sort of comes under erasure and is suppressed, and it's demonized, and it's something that has to be sort of, you know, thrown away. Even the days of the week were changed. We don't have Wednesday. We have the midday, the middle of the week. We have sun and moon, Sunday, Monday, but Tuesday does not keep the old name. Thursday, Thor was the most revered god of all in Iceland, perhaps because he was the one who rode in his wagon, and kept away the threat of the Jotuns and the Thurs, the ones that were about to attack. So Thor was the one who kept order somehow with his hammer. And the thing is that, of course, a lot of this religion just went underground, and that was the pact to begin with. The agreement was, okay, you'll take the new faith, Christianity, but what people could continue doing was to practice their old faith as long as nobody knew about it. They were to keep it secret. In fact, so they could have it both ways. And it seems that it became a custom. And then, Lutheranism came along, and sure, you can keep the old faith, you can keep the newer Catholic faith, and then we just, add this new one. It's a win-win situation.
Yeah. Are berserkers a form of troll?
Sorry?
Are berserkers a form of troll?
The thing is that I had a biology teacher way back who gave quite a few lectures on berserker mushrooms. And the thing is that the mushrooms grow all over Iceland and in different other places. What you do is, according to what he told us, was the people would, someone who didn't have any teeth, an old crone or an old guy, would be the perfect candidate for chewing the berserker mushroom, because it initially, the first chews make you really sick and you vomit. So it's the perfect thing for these old guys to just chew on the mushroom and get really sick, and then once the poison was out, someone would collect all the different chewed on mushrooms, and they would be given to the berserkers, who and the effect of the remaining poison was to make them feel invincible, extremely aggressive, and just go. So a berserker was in fact man-made by a mushroom. Yeah.
It's fly agaric in English, the berserker.
Yeah.
Fly agaric.
Berserker.
Yes, contains some certain parts which create a hive.
Yeah.
The other thing is that the trolls or giants are in all Germanic legends,
Yeah.
whatever you go. The settlers just brought it with them, adjusted it a little bit to the landscape, I think.
Totally. It seems that, in fact, the countries that didn't have mountains, or not very many, not very tall, like Denmark, the southern part of Sweden for certain, it seems that they would shrink their trolls so that they would fit into a bog or under a bridge or into a little cave somewhere. And possibly also this happens when, in urban areas. So that's perhaps why Winnipeg has so many giantesses or trolls underneath their bridges.
Or a lot of berserker mushrooms.
Yeah.
Hiding from the trolls or the giants?
there doesn't seem to be much interaction, as far as I can tell, between and in fact the little people, again, the same happened with the elves, and that will be my next talk. That the same thing happened with the elves, and they also shrank in different parts. And it seems that it was more likely to happen in urban areas, where all figures would sort of become shorter. And in fact, in Iceland, the dwarfs only survive as legends. They do not seem to have been imported until fairy tales started sort of, getting imported and adapted. But the tendency in Iceland seems to have been either to have human-sized or giants. Yeah.
Another thing that, there's speculation that I somewhere read, that the idea of trolls with superhuman strength, taller than others, sturdier than others, is a very ancient memory of the intersection between Neanderthal and Homo sapiens.
Could very well be.
Despite the ideas of the Yeti and imported here then with down with the slope, but there are these legends of huge superhuman strength, strong beings that seem to be quite common in quite different places in the world. And some people have speculated that is an ancient memory from that encounter.
It's certainly obviously an archetype, and you can see, in computer games and all kinds of fantasy literature, fantasy films, fantasy television, there are so often some kind of giants, no matter whether they are sort of kind. Even King Kong, he's a giant of a what? Gorilla. So and there are. Okay. Any other questions?
Deal with Sturla Gunnarsson's Beowulf and Grendel. Was the Grendel figure in that, or is it kind of a giant troll-like character?
Sorry.
Sturla Gunnarsson's Beowulf and Grendel.
Oh, that's a wonderful rendering. In fact, yes. I had intended to use his for my course, but then I thought I would have too much. But he in a way, it's sort of trollish greed and wanting, always it's about a businessman who always wants something bigger than he had, something, to build a bigger building, construct something more magnificent than he had before. So it sort of becomes more and more trollish until things go wrong. And the building that was to be his crowning glory becomes sort of a site of sadness and pain. So yes,
But that is
Gunnarsson's.
I don't think that is what John is referring to. I think it's the movie, the interpretation of the Grendel of Beowulf.
Oh, right.
That's what I think he means.
That film.
Film, because definitely Grendel is depicted like the troll of Atlantic folktale in that movie.
Even if he is a sort of more like a serpent or
No, he's
a
huge.
bog troll.
No, he's huge.
Yeah, but I mean, in Beowulf, the thought, he's a bog person.
But in that movie, it comes to Icelandic tradition.
Right. So what's the last name?
Sturla Gunnarsson.
That's what he Troll Church, yeah.
When you're looking at what's happening, like with the 21st century, and you're talking about Thor, it only, for me, is such a very short stretch to say about the Icelandic, Thingvellir, and is not the gavel Thor's hammer?
Okay, the gavel
The gavel in the, because Thor,
oh, yes.
you
the-
know,
the-
Thor
oh,
is
yes,
most
hammer.
revered for keeping order.
Yeah.
And his hammer would be, and is that what not a judge does? Like, is this what I'm
Possibly, but
looking at?
hammer also means, I mean, it could certainly overlap, but hammer also means sort of, you know, really steep cliff.
Okay.
Yeah. So and so you. But the thing is that yes, there may be, and the thing is that I think it's so fascinating that there is this, you know, Surtur, the guy in that picture, the one who is depicted in the Icelandic coat of arms. I mean, he's the one who guards the southwest. The cave of Surtur seems to have been a place where people went with offerings, and the cave is. I mean, it's open to all and sundry. There were just piles and piles of animal bones that had been chipped in a strange way, that were left in the cave. These have been picked up by visitors from all over the world and kept as souvenirs. So the guy who led a team that researched the cave of Surtur said that he just couldn't believe that this was just left open for everyone to pick, and you know, without ever researching it. And when they did their research, they said that stories about human habitation in that cave did not seem to be true. But what obviously had happened was that people had come there, you know, possibly to sacrifice or to share sacrificial animals, and it was the whole range of animals that had been sacrificed there. And in fact, there, inside the cave, there is this this shape of wall, which, as you can see, could be the eyebrows of Ymir, but were sort of, you know, traditional ovals or rings of most buildings. So it seems there's also there are also stories of people having been put to death on the wall inside the cave, and they think that this may be the wall. So perhaps we get to know more about Surtur. And there were also settlers who composed poems to Surtur to appease him, because I mean, he, not so long after people started settling in Iceland, Surtur was at it. He was sort of spewing fresh fire all over the land. Okay. Any other questions? One
Yeah.
here?
I'm interested in what I have understood, that there were some mythical characters that in Iceland were associated with a particular place.
Absolutely.
Or a shape or something, and then if the people who lived around there emigrated, came to Canada, those creatures wouldn't, because they belonged to that place.
Uh-huh.
But there were other forces that were associated with a family
Yeah.
or a name.
Mhm.
So if that family came
Mhm.
to North America, then the force or the spirit or the ice could come. So we have some that stayed
Yeah.
in the geography
Yeah.
of the
Yeah.
geology,
And others would
we go with
follow.
the family
Yes.
or a name.
That, I would say that that's a really fair understanding of
So
the
all those
situation.
people that, all those features, that spirits, entities that ended up in Winnipeg, they must have all come with Icelandic families and that brought them.
Obviously, the bull
Or
of
they
the bull of
interrelate.
Thorgeir was ascending, sort of a man-made horror, chasing a family, and I mean, this is on record. It says in a book that that the bull of Thorgeir emigrated with the family, that he was sent to terrorize. But then it seems that these terrors lose their power, so they get old. So, and perhaps kinder, yes?
Can you tell us a little more about the Bull of Thorgeir? I'm not familiar with that story.
Bull of Thorgeir. The Bull of Thorgeir was created, I can't remember what the ingredients were, but one of them is the hide, or rather, there was a bull, and the guy who was sort of half done flaying the hide off the bull. And then the bull sort of was raised from dead and imbued with powers, and he was to terrorize and chase anyone of a particular family, cause mischief. I can't remember whether there were any spare parts from dead people added to this particular bull. But it's quite easy to find information on the Bull of Thorgeir. Yeah, so if you want to make one of your own, there is a recipe.
All right, I think we'll end it here, but thank you so much for this fascinating lecture. Thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you